The smell of freshly baked sufganiyot usually filled the synagogue hall with warmth, a sweet promise of celebration. Tonight, however, a chill hung in the air, thick and heavy, despite the flickering Hanukkah lights. Everyone gathered around the large menorah, the flames dancing, reflecting in the expectant eyes of the children. I stood a little to the side, watching the elder, Rabbi Mendel, prepare for his annual address. For years, I had poured my heart into this community, dedicating countless hours to its programs, its people, its very soul. I organized events, taught classes, and helped those in need, often working tirelessly behind the scenes. As Rabbi Mendel began to speak, his voice boomed, full of self-importance. He spoke of the synagogue's growth, its renewed spirit, its many successes, and then he turned his gaze directly to me, a look that wasn't kind, but dismissive. "Of course," he said, his words cutting through the festive atmosphere like a cold wind. Some minor contributions were made by others. But let us be clear, all true progress, all significant achievements, all the light we see here tonight stems from the wisdom and guidance bestowed upon us by the Almighty through my humble leadership. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, making sure everyone understood that my years of labor were nothing more than footnotes to his grand narrative. Then, in a move that felt both deliberate and cruel, he walked to the menorah. Instead of adding a flame or simply observing, he reached out and, with a calculated motion, pinched the wick of one of the newly lit candles between his fingers. The light sputtered, then died, leaving a wisp of smoke curling into the air. A gasp rippled through the congregation. It was a public act of disrespect, a symbolic extinguishing of my efforts, my presence, my very spirit in front of everyone. A profound silence descended, broken only by the soft murmurs that followed. My chest tightened, a familiar ache blooming. But instead of the usual sting of humiliation, a strange calm washed over me. I met his gaze, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding. My voice, when it came, was soft but clear, carrying just enough to be heard in the hushed hall. "Some lights once dimmed," I stated, looking directly at the extinguished wick, "reveal a truer flame." The murmurs grew louder, a confused buzz filling the space. Then, from the front row, a small figure detached itself. It was young David, barely 6, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and determination. He carried a small, unlit candle which he had been holding. With surprising grace for his age, he walked to the menorah, carefully touched his unlit wick to one of the still burning candles, and then, with a shy but firm gesture, relit the candle Rabbi Mendel had just extinguished. The small flame caught, dancing brightly, a defiant spark in the sudden tension. It was a simple act, yet it felt like a clap of thunder. A quiet, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips. For every shadow cast, a light ignites. The elder stood frozen, his eyes narrowed, clearly bewildered by this unexpected turn of events. He hadn't anticipated such a simple, yet potent, response. The congregation watched, some with dawning comprehension, others still processing the strange unfolding drama. Without another word, I turned, a subtle knowing glint in my eye, and walked away from the gathering, towards the synagogue's ancient archives. The heavy wooden door creaked open, then closed behind me, leaving the elder bewildered, and the entire congregation wondering what would come next. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. My steps echoed softly on the worn stone floor as I moved deeper into the archives, the scent of old paper and dust a familiar comfort. The silence here was different from the strained quiet of the main hall. It was a silence filled with history, with untold stories. To understand what had just happened, what had been building for so long, you have to go back. Way back. I grew up in a vibrant, close-knit Jewish community nestled in an ancient European city. It was a place where history wasn't just in books, it was etched into every cobblestone, breathed in with the aroma of freshly baked challah from the corner bakery, and sung in the prayers echoing from the synagogue. Our streets were narrow, winding paths that opened into bustling market squares, always full of life and the chatter of Yiddish, Hebrew, and the local tongue. The synagogue wasn't just a building, it was the beating heart of our world, a place of learning, laughter, and solemn observance. My family was deeply rooted in this tradition. Faith wasn't something we just practiced on Sabbaths. It was woven into the fabric of our daily lives. Mornings began with prayers, meals were shared with blessings, and evenings often ended with stories from the Torah. My father, a kind and patient man, spent hours teaching me the intricacies of Jewish law and history, instilling in me a deep love for our heritage. My mother, with her endless energy, taught me the importance of community service, always the first to organize help for those in need, to prepare meals for the sick, or to welcome newcomers. From a young age, I dreamed of becoming a respected scholar, a leader who could guide our community with wisdom and compassion. I devoured every sacred text I could get my hands on, spent countless hours in study, and tried to absorb every lesson from the elders. There was a certain weight to these dreams, a sense of responsibility to honor my family's legacy and the expectations of our community. Everyone knew my potential, and I felt the quiet pressure to live up to it, to make a meaningful contribution to our people. It was during these formative years that Rabbi Mendel, the elder who had just extinguished the candle, entered my life more prominently. He was, at the time, a charismatic and influential figure, already revered for his vast knowledge and powerful sermons. He saw something in my dedication, my thirst for learning, and took me under his wing. He became my mentor, guiding me through complex religious texts, introducing me to influential scholars, and giving me opportunities to speak and teach within the community. He was the one who encouraged my path towards becoming a rabbi, subtly weaving himself into the fabric of my aspirations, making me believe that my journey was intertwined with his wisdom. We shared a history of devotion, a mutual respect that felt unbreakable then. Our discussions about faith, community, and the future of our people were long and passionate, often stretching late into the night. I looked up to him, saw him as a spiritual father, someone whose guidance was invaluable. He taught me so much, and I was grateful. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the dynamic began to shift. The shared respect started to feel less mutual. His guidance became less about nurturing my growth and more about directing my actions, always subtly, always under the guise of wisdom. This gradual change, this slow erosion of an equal partnership into something more hierarchical, laid the groundwork for the tension that would eventually explode on that Hanukkah night. It was a long road from youthful admiration to the cold, dismissive act I had just witnessed. And it was a road paved with many small, almost unnoticeable compromises. Many moments where I dismissed a feeling of unease as merely my own youthful insecurity. Those small compromises, those dismissed feelings of unease, they weren't isolated incidents. Over the years, they formed a pattern, a slow accumulation of emotional cracks that steadily eroded the foundation of our relationship. It wasn't one big betrayal, but a series of subtle ones that chipped away at my trust and self-worth. I remember countless times when I would pour hours into developing a new community program, meticulously planning every detail, only for Rabbi Mendel to present it as his own idea in community meetings. He'd stand there, beaming, accepting all the praise, while I sat in the audience, a silent contributor, my efforts reduced to a footnote. He never explicitly said, "This was my idea," but his language, his way of framing things, always implied it. He'd say, "I've been thinking, and I believe we should implement this," even though this was something I had presented to him in detail the week before. Then there were the veiled humiliations. He had a knack for public corrections that felt more like subtle put-downs. If I offered an interpretation of a text during a study session, he would often interject, not to clarify, but to subtly undermine my understanding. "That's an interesting perspective," he'd say, with a paternalistic smile, "but perhaps you've overlooked this more traditional reading, which, of course, is the generally accepted one." It wasn't a direct insult, but it was enough to make me feel small, to question my own intellect in front of others. These moments, always delivered with a veneer of mentorship, chipped away at my confidence, making me hesitant to speak up, to share my own insights. His manipulation was perhaps the most insidious. Rabbi Mendel was a master at using guilt and religious authority to control my decisions. If I ever considered pursuing an opportunity outside the synagogue, or even spending more time on personal studies that didn't directly benefit his agenda, he would invoke my duty to the community, my sacred obligation. "A true leader," he would tell me, his voice heavy with expectation, "puts the needs of the congregation before their own desires. Your gifts are meant for us." It was difficult to argue against such a powerful appeal, especially when it came from someone I respected, someone who spoke with the weight of generations of tradition behind him. He'd paint a picture of me abandoning my responsibilities, leaving the community vulnerable, and I, eager to prove my devotion, would always fall back in line. There were also the moments of injustice, clear instances where I was passed over for leadership roles despite having superior qualifications. I had worked tirelessly, gained expertise, and earned the respect of many congregants. Yet, when a position opened, it invariably went to someone else, often a less experienced individual who was more pliable to Rabbi Mendel's influence. He never directly blocked my advancement, but his subtle machinations were clear. A quiet word here, a suggestive comment there, a slight emphasis on my youthful enthusiasm rather than my seasoned judgment. These small, almost imperceptible roadblocks ensured I remained under his thumb, always contributing but never truly leading. The Hanukkah incident wasn't a sudden explosion. It wasn't the first time he had taken credit, or publicly dismissed me, or manipulated my choices. It was, instead, the last straw. It was the culmination of years of emotional wear and tear, a pattern of disrespect and manipulation that had finally reached its breaking point. That night, as he extinguished the candle, it wasn't just a light going out, it was the final, definitive act in a long, drawn-out process that had slowly extinguished my spirit. It confirmed what I had long suspected, but refused to fully acknowledge. His mentorship had become a cage, his guidance a form of control, and my devotion a tool for his own aggrandizement. The shock wasn't in the act itself, but in the blatant public nature of it, finally stripping away all pretense of mutual respect. After that Hanukkah night, the air within the synagogue, and indeed the whole community, became incredibly thick. It was like walking through treacle, every interaction feeling heavy and strained. The tension was something you could almost taste, a bitter residue left by Rabbi Mendel's public display. Before, his undermining was subtle, almost deniable. Now it was out in the open, a wound festering for everyone to see. Disagreements between him and me, which used to be rare and carefully veiled, became more frequent. They often started as theological debates during study sessions or community meetings, but everyone knew they were really about power. I would present an interpretation of a scripture, carefully reasoned and backed by tradition, and he would counter with a dismissal, not of the text, but of my ability to truly grasp its depth. A young mind, he'd declare, looking around the room, can sometimes grasp the branches but miss the roots. His words were always just ambiguous enough to avoid a direct confrontation, but pointed enough to chip away at my authority. My responses, though calm, held a new firmness. I wasn't just debating scripture anymore. I was defending my right to speak, to lead, to exist as an equal in that space. The community, caught in the middle, started to feel the pressure. It wasn't long before people began taking sides, sometimes openly, more often through quiet whispers and knowing glances. Some congregants, particularly the younger ones, and those who had seen Rabbi Mendel's subtle manipulations over the years, offered quiet words of encouragement to me. They'd approach after services, a hand on my arm, a look of understanding in their eyes. "Don't let him get to you," one would say. "We know your heart is true." But others, especially the older members who had known Rabbi Mendel for decades, clung to his long-standing authority. They saw him as the bedrock of their faith, and any challenge to him felt like a challenge to their entire world. Their loyalty was born of habit and respect, making them blind to the changes in his behavior, or perhaps unwilling to see them. Rabbi Mendel, sensing the shift, became more openly critical, more dismissive. He used his position, his sermons, even casual conversations, to isolate me. If there was a committee meeting, I might find myself subtly excluded from a key discussion. If I proposed a new community initiative, he would find a way to quietly funnel resources away from it, or assign it to someone else, effectively killing it before it even started. He'd make remarks about new ideas that lack wisdom, or ambition without experience, clearly aimed at me, though never calling me out by name directly. He was trying to cut off my support, to make me an island in the very community I had dedicated my life to serving. The weight of this judgment, from neighbors, relatives, and fellow congregants, became an almost unbearable burden. Every smile felt scrutinized, every conversation a potential minefield. I felt watched, judged, and increasingly alone. The synagogue, once a sanctuary, started to feel like a gilded cage, the walls closing in. It was a suffocating feeling, an emotional pressure that left me breathless. I'd walk through the streets, once so familiar and comforting, and feel the eyes on me, the whispers following me. It was a profound sense of isolation, a despair that settled deep in my bones. This period, after the Hanukkah incident, was the peak of my emotional distress. It was a slow, agonizing process where I felt myself being pushed to the very edge. The breaking point felt inevitable, not a question of if, but when. I knew something had to give, because I couldn't continue to live under that kind of constant, soul-crushing pressure. The silence from some, the open criticism from others, and Rabbi Mendel's relentless campaign to marginalize me created an atmosphere where I felt I was losing myself, piece by painful piece. That feeling of being pushed to the brink, of the walls closing in, didn't last forever. The Hanukkah incident, with its public display of disrespect and the unexpected defiance of that small child, had been a turning point in more ways than one. When I walked towards the synagogue's ancient archives that night, it wasn't just an escape. It was a deliberate move. I needed answers, something concrete to make sense of the years of subtle manipulation and the recent open hostility. My despair, while profound, was slowly hardening into resolve. The archives were a place I knew well, a labyrinth of dusty shelves and brittle texts. I spent days, then weeks, poring over old ledgers, community minutes, and correspondence. It was tedious work, often frustrating, but I felt a quiet certainty guiding me. I wasn't just looking for proof of Rabbi Mendel's malice. I was looking for patterns, for the root of his behavior. What I found was far more devastating than I could have imagined. Hidden within decades-old financial records, tucked away in obscure appendices and cross-referenced with almost invisible footnotes, was the truth. It began with small irregularities, easily dismissed as clerical errors from a bygone era. But as I pieced them together, a clearer, uglier picture emerged. There were expenditures that didn't match receipts, donations recorded but never accounted for in community projects, and large sums designated for charitable causes that simply vanished. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was deliberate, meticulously hidden misappropriation of community funds. This wasn't a recent development, it dated back decades, woven into the very fabric of the synagogue's financial history, carefully obscured by Rabbi Mendel's long tenure and unquestioned authority. The discovery hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just about my personal struggle with him anymore. This was a betrayal of the entire community, a violation of the trust placed in a spiritual leader. The weight of this knowledge was immense. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I had to expose him. The decision was difficult, fraught with fear of the fallout, but it was also clear. My own standing, my own reputation, suddenly seemed secondary to the integrity of our faith and the well-being of the community. Rabbi Mendel, perhaps sensing my investigation, or perhaps just emboldened by his escalating power, began to intensify his efforts to discredit me. Rumors started circulating that I was unstable, that I was obsessed with him, that I was trying to undermine the synagogue from within. He tried to block my access to certain historical documents, claiming they were too sensitive or irrelevant. But by then, I had already found what I needed. His actions only confirmed the depth of his deceit. As fate would have it, this devastating discovery coincided with an upcoming regional rabbinical council meeting. This wasn't just a local gathering, it was a formal assembly where community leaders and scholars from across the region would convene. It was an unexpected opportunity, a platform where the truth could be heard, not just by our small congregation, but by a wider, more authoritative body. This moment shattered the cycle of suffering I had been trapped in. I was no longer the victim of Rabbi Mendel's manipulations. I had found the evidence and with it, the power to act. The burden was still heavy, but it was a different kind of weight now. The weight of responsibility, of being an agent of change. The stage was set, not just for a confrontation, but for justice. The quiet despair had transformed into a fierce determination. I was ready. The weight of the truth I held was immense, a heavy stone in my gut. I felt a churning mix of fear and a strange kind of calm. Fear, because I knew what exposing Rabbi Mendel would mean, not just for him, but for our entire community. Doubt gnawed at me. Could I really be the one to bring down a man who had been revered for decades? The moral burden was almost crushing. Exposing him would rip through the fabric of our synagogue, a place I loved, a place that had shaped me. It felt like tearing apart my own family. The news, or rather, the rumors of my investigation, spread like wildfire. Our community was small and tightly knit. Everyone knew everyone. Whispers turned into open discussions in the synagogue courtyard, in the market, even during family dinners. People reacted in so many different ways. Some of the older members, who had known Rabbi Mendel their whole lives, expressed shock and disbelief. They couldn't fathom that a man they had trusted, who had presided over their weddings and funerals, could be capable of such deceit. They clung to the idea of his sanctity, viewing my actions as an attack on tradition itself. Then there were those who offered quiet support. A few congregants, mostly younger ones, who had perhaps felt the weight of Rabbi Mendel's rigid authority themselves, would approach me discreetly. They'd nod, offer a small encouraging word, or share their own hushed stories of his questionable dealings. These small gestures were lifelines in a sea of uncertainty. They made me feel less alone, reminding me that my fight wasn't just my own, but a vocal minority staunchly defended the elder. They saw me as a disruptive force, someone trying to stir up trouble where there was none. They accused me of disrespecting an elder, of breaking community harmony. Their words were sharp, accusatory. They called me bitter, jealous, and even suggested I was seeking personal gain. It was hard to hear, truly. To be painted as the villain when I felt I was trying to do what was right was incredibly painful. The traditional values of respecting elders clashed violently with the need for accountability, and I was caught right in the middle of that conflict. The tight-knit nature of our community, usually a source of comfort, now amplified the division. Every glance, every hushed conversation felt directed at me. I could feel eyes on me during services, during Shabbat meals. The news wasn't just news, it was a personal drama playing out in everyone's lives. It sparked intense debate, pitting neighbor against neighbor, sometimes even family against family. In this whirlwind, a few younger congregants, surprisingly, stepped forward as allies. They were bright, energetic, and unafraid to challenge the status quo. They had heard my stories, seen the evidence I had started to compile, and believed me. They began to help, quietly gathering more information, cross-referencing dates, and even speaking to others who had been too afraid to come forward before. Their courage gave me strength. On the other hand, many others, fearful of challenging such a powerful figure, simply turned away. They avoided eye contact, changed the subject when I approached, or simply disappeared from my life. It was a stark reminder of the power dynamics at play, and how deeply ingrained the fear of authority was. The psychological impact of all this was profound. I endured public scrutiny, ostracization from some, and the immense emotional weight of potentially dismantling a decades-old community structure. There were nights I couldn't sleep, replaying conversations, doubting my own sanity. I felt a deep, aching loneliness. The pressure was constant, a heavy cloak I couldn't shed. This period was marked by profound psychological stress, but underneath it all, a quiet resolve hardened. I knew I had to see this through. The day of the rabbinical council meeting arrived, heavy with expectation. With my allies by my side, we presented the findings. The evidence, meticulously gathered and cross-referenced by myself and the younger congregants, was overwhelming. There were ledgers with doctored figures, letters confirming the elders' redirection of charitable donations, and even witness testimonies from former synagogue employees who had been too intimidated to speak out before. The room was silent as I laid it all out, the weight of years of deceit finally exposed. When it was the elder's turn to speak, he tried to deny everything, to paint me as a disgruntled employee, a slanderer. But his words lacked conviction. He stammered, his usual charismatic facade crumbling under the relentless assault of truth. The council members, initially torn between their respect for his long service and the undeniable facts, eventually had to concede. The proof was irrefutable. The consequences were swift and severe. The elder was stripped of all his leadership roles within the synagogue and the wider community. His name, once synonymous with wisdom and piety, was now tainted by scandal. It was a painful moment for everyone, a stark reminder that even those we hold in the highest regard can fall short. The community, though reeling from the shock, began a difficult but necessary process of healing and re-evaluation. For me, the immediate aftermath was a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. The The constant pressure I had lived under for so long finally lifted. I had done what I set out to do, but the path had taken its toll. Slowly, though, I began to heal. The quiet nods of approval from people who had once been wary, the sincere apologies from those who had doubted me, all helped to mend the emotional wounds. I found strength in the renewed trust of the community, in knowing that I had acted with integrity, even when it was the hardest thing to do. I didn't emerge as a hero, not in the traditional sense, but I had emerged as something perhaps more important, a moral compass. My voice, once silenced and dismissed, now carried a new weight, a new respect. I was no longer just a scholar. I was someone who had stood for truth, even when it meant standing alone. The community, though scarred by the betrayal, began to rebuild itself. There was a newfound commitment to transparency and ethical leadership. Committees were formed, new oversight measures put in place. It was a slow process, but it was earnest. And thanks to the thoroughness of our investigation, the stolen funds were eventually recovered. They were redirected to their original charitable purposes, helping those in need, just as they were always intended to do. It felt like a small victory, a tangible act of restorative justice. Looking back, I reflect on the enduring power of truth. It can be buried, twisted, and denied, but eventually it finds a way to surface. I learned the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem insurmountable, even when it means facing down powerful figures. The light of faith, much like the Menorah's flame, can illuminate even the darkest corners. It doesn't always burn brightly and without struggle. Sometimes it flickers, sometimes it's almost extinguished, but it's in those moments of adversity that its true meaning is revealed. It's not just about tradition or ritual, it's about integrity, justice, and the unwavering belief in a better way. And that, I realized, was a flame worth protecting.